Thanks, Ruth. I am calling in from the West Coast in the US, and thank you for including me in the conversation. The color of hope is green. What an excellent title for what we are seeing around the world today. But before getting into my take on the details of hope and its color, allow me to acknowledge a few things. There's nothing like a crisis to sharpen our views of the world around us. Crises hold a mirror up to us and to our societies without us wanting to look. The multiple crises of health, climate, social justice so far reveal that our institutions are inadequate to address the tasks at hand. And I know this isn't a statement of hope, but it is the reality of the moment. But what also comes with a crisis is a time for reflection, a time to put forward new ideas and new pathways on new thinking. And it is in these where I see hope, and much of it is indeed green. Now, there are three themes that I'd like to point out. Ruth mentioned finance, that's one of them. And what I see there are new players that have entered into the debate on climate action, raising the level of sophistication of the conversation. Second, there's visible progress on needed technologies. And third, climate has moved from what I'd call an adjacent policy to a central issue in policy agendas around the world. So starting with the first theme, new entrants and an increased level of sophistication in the climate conversation. What comes to mind here are businesses and financial institutions. We are witnessing a change in approach as businesses are revealing both their exposure to climate risk, but also their plans to address it. Corporate planning appears more forceful and active on climate. New quantitative tools reveal the costs of inaction, allowing political cover, but also needed tools and data allowing corporates to put forth serious targets, or at least they sound serious. Meanwhile, financial institutions, including central banks and regulators, other regulatory bodies are actively engaging in debate and research. As a start, they offer guidance on disclosure and stress testing for climate risk. There's a bit of a dance going on between regulators, investors, businesses, and their validators on what this guidance means and how it will ultimately be used by different parties. This leads to a bit of uncertainty, and this uncertainty leads to justifiable skepticism coming from civil society. Name changes and vague long-term targets don't always add up to true transformation. And further, the average lifespan of companies indicates that many companies won't even be around to meet their 2050 goals. But I think with time and reinforcement from the investor and regulatory communities, there's a higher chance for real transformation in businesses and financial markets. And so these entrants into the conversation is most welcome. But we need to acknowledge that the conversation still needs to be enhanced. So the second theme that I see progress in is on technology. And here I would categorize things three ways. One, technologies that have exceeded expectations, technologies that are perennially brought up or revisited due to changing conditions, and finally, promising new technologies in key sectors. There's, of course, a lot of detail here, and many of you probably have your own lists once you see these categories, and so I'll just flag a few from my own perspective on what gives me hope. So batteries and more broadly, energy storage options have exceeded expectations, turning the transport sector from one that was seen as hard to decarbonize into one that might decarbonize at a faster rate than other sectors. Estimates now show that cost parity between electric vehicles and incumbents might be reached in the next few years, far outpacing expectations and allowing for more aggressive supporting policies. Next, regarding perennial solutions, green hydrogen is on the rise again in debates. To me, this is less about technological progress and instead points to trends of business models that are better aligned with climate policy. Hydrogen pairs with a future, or green hydrogen in particular, pairs well with a future that includes abundant and cheap renewable energy. Now, it remains to be seen if this will work, but it points to emerging thinking around business models that depend not on business as usual, but instead depend on economic conditions envisioned within climate policies. The more of these that emerge, the better, as they reinforce our expectations, which in turn can attract more investment and supporting policies. And finally, there are emerging technologies that are quite promising. And for me here, I think of industrial applications, including breakthroughs in cement, steel, and materials switching more broadly in manufacturing. If such technologies progress, like that of batteries, we could see within this decade the potential of turning more and more problem sectors into solution sectors. So finally, the third theme that I mentioned earlier is on policy. And here we're seeing policy shifts. Now, of course, you can all tell by now that I'm American by my accent. And for some Europeans in the audience, you might think policy shifts toward climate are old news. But I'd suggest that this new wave of policy shifts is not only US focused, though indeed the Biden administration certainly embodies this shift. So what am I talking about? I see policymakers at all levels, local on up, that are placing climate at the center of their agendas. The difference here is that even 5 years ago, climate policy was adjacent policy, not central. This meant that you had energy policy first with climate benefits on the side. You had transport policy focused on efficiency and safety, and they had some climate benefits. Regulations on air quality, which again had climate benefits, and so on. But today, climate appears to have come into its own, where climate now drives shifts in policy on energy, transport, land use, infrastructure, and so on. So this centrality of climate is exciting. It's very exciting, but it's also daunting. For one, climate advocates went from outsiders to insiders and are now grappling with questions of how truly fast we might transition. Second, policymakers are now weighing trade-offs more seriously, as their climate policies also include other adjacent aims like equity, social, racial, and climate justice. This necessitates slowing down the conversation to include voices that were sidelined in the fossil economy, which caused not just the climate crisis, but countless environmental crises felt daily in frontline and fence-line communities. Now, the data scientist me is excited for the challenge of this. This is a huge multi-goal programming problem on a scale never really seen before. But at the same time, the realist in me is concerned. I'm concerned that the future energy economy, with its new materials demand, supply chains, infrastructure needs, and so on, might just repeat some of the same mistakes of the fossil energy economy. And so equity must be weighed alongside the expediency of action on climate change through developing inclusive and participatory processes on policy. In other words, even though I'm so excited about climate being central, equity must together occupy our central policy aims. And now regarding whether or not all of these actions add up to enough, it's really hard to come up with an answer right now, as there's so much ongoing activity. The details of new policies and pronouncements, especially those of last week, hide whether or not this all adds up to real transition. But in my view, the way to make this green hope into durable change resides in part with the students in the audience. In each of these areas that I pointed out, finance, technology, and policy, there remains a tremendous amount of work, and institutions are scrambling for what I might call climate-informed talent. In finance, regulators, businesses, and investors need interpreters who understand not just the economics, but also the science, the engineering, and the logistics of making targets durable. In technology, in order for these to be truly promising and to become useful, we need engineers and scientists who are able to develop a business plan that links their actions to a wider narrative on climate. This will allow them to unlock the needed funding from governments and investors that are actively looking for fundable projects. And finally, it takes informed government actors willing to test and adjust policies to fit local conditions. Now, all of this points to a need for interdisciplinary approaches and the need to learn each other's languages. And I acknowledge that, of course, I'm speaking my native language, and that's a huge privilege. And I'm not talking about speaking English, but instead about the language of policymakers, the language of investors, of regulators, of engineers and scientists. We need to speak more to each other and learn what the right questions are, so that way we can ask how we might work better together. And with that, I'll pause, but I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.